Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks once again for joining us this week. Our conversation this week will be with Kat Brooks, but before we begin, I would like to read our land acknowledgement. We recognize that California State University San Bernardino sits on the territory and ancestral land of the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians, Yuha Vietnam. We recognize that every member of the California State University San Bernardino community has benefited and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1965. Consistent with our values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold California State University San Bernardino more accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous peoples. And now I will turn it over to Dr. Mary Texeira.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. This is our last program of the semester, and this culminates our 90th event in 3 years. As many of you know, we started at the death of George Floyd that traumatized the entire nation, I think. And we have just had the most wonderful scholars and activists and victims that you will ever find in one space, I think, including our guests today. We rarely have good news. We started a few years ago with giving out good news before our panelists spoke. But we do have some today, a little light at the end of that tunnel, or a silver lining, and that is we have been talking in this space about deputy gangs quite a bit. We've had several guests, and it was just announced this week that the lawsuit that was directed at deputy gangs in one particular station, that's East LA station. And this lawsuit is different because it is being started by 8 deputies from East LA station, 8 new deputies who have been threatened, who claim to be threatened, their families threatened, and in police lingo, we call it no-acking calls, which means that when you have a distress call, they're not answered. So these new deputies have claimed that this has been happening to them, and their families have been threatened. They have been beaten. So the new sheriff has done something a little bit better in that he has acknowledged at least that there have been gangs in just about every sheriff's station. He did promise to do something about it, has not done anything about it yet, whereas the old sheriff did not acknowledge deputy gangs at all. In fact, the oversight committee for the LA Sheriff's Department found, quote, a cancer, unquote, of deputy gangs, and they recommended 20 changes, or 24 changes, and so far none have been implemented. So I had to end with bad news, but at least the good news is that the suit is going forward. And with that, wordy announcement, I will turn it over to my colleague, Robie Madrigal.
Thank you, Mary. I'd like to add my welcome and thank everyone for joining us today. As Mary mentioned, this is our 90th episode, and it takes a great deal of work, requires a lot of behind-the-scenes work and effort. And I just wanted to thank Thin Lee, our IT support person, who's been with us from the start. And because the program runs smoothly, it's testimony to his efforts and professionalism and dedication. So thank you, Thin. I'd also like to thank the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, as well as the Pfau Library, for supporting this program for well over 3 years now. When this program started, there were a number of late night emails to get the program going. And it's been a great experience, learned a lot. I'll now introduce Ms. Kat Brooks. Ms. Brooks has actually joined, this is her second time joining us. She joined us in 2021, and we're glad to have her back. She is the host of Law and Disorder on KPFA. She's a longtime performer, organizer, activist. She played a central role in the struggle for justice for Oscar Grant and spent the last decade working with impacted communities and families to rapidly respond to police violence and radically transform the ways our communities are policed and incarcerated. She's co-founder of the Anti-Police Terror Project and the executive director of the Justice Teams Network. Ms. Brooks was also the runner-up in Oakland's 2018 mayoral election, facing incumbent Libby Schaaf. With that said, I'll turn it over to you, Ms. Brooks.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm very happy to be here with you again. Before we get started, I want to start the way that I start most of my presentations, and that is taking a moment of silence for all of the lives that have been lost, both to the streets and to the state. In APTP and the Anti-Police Terror Project, however, we say that all violence is state violence because it is the state that creates the conditions that facilitate intercommunal and interpersonal violence in our poorest, blackest, and most marginalized communities. So we can take that moment of silence now. Alan Bluford was 18. He was unarmed and running away when an Oakland police officer, Miguel Masso, shot him in the back and killed him. Miguel Masso had come from New York, where he had at least 2 other incidents of officer-involved shootings on his jacket. None of us knew that when he came into our community here in Oakland. Following the murder of Alan Bluford, and actually the anniversary of Alan's murder just passed this past Saturday, the community response was so great that Miguel Masso left the Oakland Police Department, but then he just moved north to another police department, which we only found out about because he battered an elderly man there, and their family Googled him and saw what had happened here to Alan. Demaria Hogg was actually my daughter's best friend's father when she was in elementary school, and he was sleeping in his car in the middle of the night. There was a gun on the front seat. This is Oakland. Folks carry firearms. It was not in his hands. He was shot and killed within seconds of being startled awake by law enforcement. Marcellus Tony was unarmed and in the middle of a mental health crisis on a bus in East Oakland. He was tased to death by law enforcement. And that's important because we hear a lot, right, about less lethal weapons. And it's really important to understand that tasers kill too, batons kill too. When we were doing the vigil for Marcellus Tony and we were talking about what had happened to him and that tasers aren't less lethal weapons and that actually it's the institution of policing and what it was born to do that ends up murdering us. The co-founder of my organization, Terha Ox, said, if you arm them with a bouquet of flowers, they will choke us to death with those flowers. Celeste Guap, she's still alive, but she was raped and trafficked by the Oakland Police Department and 14 other law enforcement agencies across the Bay Area. Yvette Henderson was gunned down in broad daylight with an AR-15 on the West Oakland-Emeryville border. Her alleged crime, was shoplifting out of a Home Depot. Nathaniel Wilkes, Richard Perkins, Joshua Pollack, Eric Salgado, James Rivera, Colby Friday, Natasha McKenna. I could go on and on. Last year, the police killed 1,066 people, more people than they had killed the year before. The rebellions, the uprisings that happened in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. And to date, this year, just in May, 343 people have been gunned down by law enforcement. When you break down the numbers, you're talking about at least 3 people every 28 hours that are killed by law enforcement in this country. And one has to ask themselves, and I ask myself all the time, right? Because I've been doing this work for a hot minute, what will it take to actually stop it? And that is actually why the Anti-Police Terror Project was born. We were born because we were tired of simply responding to state violence, but instead wanted to get in front of it. We asked ourselves, after being in the streets for almost 2 years in response to the murder of Oscar Grant, who was murdered on January 1st, 2009 at the Fruitvale BART station. After being in the street for or almost 2 years in response to his murder, we started to ask ourselves, right? Like, what do we do with all of this rage that will actually stop the genocide from happening in this country? How do we funnel people's rage into strategic organizing, a tactical movement, right, with the intention of interrupting state violence before it happened? How do we support family members, right, who are just going about their lives, living the best that they can before this egregious act happens to them? Um, so APTP formed because we didn't just want to be reactionary, but we wanted to be visionary. We still believe that reaction matters, right? Protest matters. But if that protest isn't being funneled into actual movement that generates change, then at some point you have to question its utility and your utility as an organizer. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the work of the Anti-Police Terror Project. I mentioned the families. We work incredibly closely with families. We support them from the moment they lose their loved ones for as long as they want. And that support includes a bunch of stuff. It includes mental and emotional support. We have a weekly support group for our families. Something that's really important about that, though, is that it's not just bringing them together, right, where they can share stories with people that have experienced similar things. It is also a place where we focus on developing their leadership skills, right, so that they can take their rightful place as leaders in this movement. It can range from someone needs their yard trimmed or someone needs groceries bought. We also do financial support, legal and communications work. We work on policy at the local and state levels. So the Anti-Police Terror Project actually gave birth to this concept that you've heard called defund. Here in Oakland, we are the longest running defund campaign in the country, having given birth to that campaign 8 years ago, actually in response to the revelation that Celeste Guap had been raped and trafficked by 14 law enforcement agencies. We began asking ourselves, what are we funding them for? Where is all of our money going, right? And that's when we discovered that here in Oakland, and this is true for municipalities across this country, they got almost half of our general funds. Your general funds are what you use to fix potholes, to keep your parks clean, to make sure libraries stay open, things that we want, things that we know create healthy, safe communities, right? Affordable housing, things like that, mental health and emotional support. And our first demand of the defund campaign that we launched here was 50% of the Oakland Police Department's budget to go to 24/7 mental health crisis support services that did not lead with a badge and a gun. And at that time, we also demanded an investment in developing a system, right? A mental health crisis response system, a community crisis response system that did not lead with a badge and a gun and or law enforcement. We've passed bills at the state level. I mentioned Miguel Masso and how he slid from New York to Oakland to another department up north. Part of what that's called is a lateral move. And it is the way that departments deal with bad acting cops, particularly if there's a lot of community outrage. But some of the state legislation that we've passed is actually going to help interrupt some of those patterns. It was SB 2. And it's the decertification bill. And it means that cops can no longer just rape and kill with impunity, that they actually can be decertified and prevented from being law enforcement anywhere else in the country. We also last year successfully passed the Crisis Act, which I'm super excited about. Crisis Act will fund grassroots groups to create alternative responses to community crisis like mental health, intimate partner violence, natural disasters, intercommunal violence, and substance abuse issues. I always sort of want to stick on the substance abuse issue for a second because, again, why are we sending badges and guns to someone who is expressing their trauma through the overutilization of substances? What is a badge and a gun going to do for someone who may be ODing or who may need to go into rehab? Nothing. It's actually just going to escalate and exacerbate the trauma that person is already experiencing. And so we're having these conversations, right, around the country about what public safety actually means and what it should look like. And then the other big piece of work that we do at the Anti-Police Terror Project is that we develop alternative responses to community crisis that should not and do not need responses with a badge and a gun. So our program, Mental Health First, is the only non-911 response for mental health and other community crisis support. It operates in Oakland, San Francisco, and Sacramento, and we are currently training municipalities and grassroots groups across the country. We also successfully advocated for the city of Oakland to adopt its own version of response without community crisis, because we believe you need both. You need the municipality to be acting right in a way that is forward thinking and progressive, but you also need systems that are completely divorced from the state, because for Black and Brown and Indigenous and poor people, there are large swaths of us that are never going to call 911. We are never going to engage the state, right? And so we have to have a vehicle for those folks to get help too. And we've been successful here in Oakland, and it's probably the only city department that I've ever successfully worked with, and that there's been this good relationship where we are in regular communication and talking frequently about how we can work with each other so we can serve more and more of our people. It's an exciting time because even though we dealt with the misinformation, disinformation campaign about defund, let me be really clear, defund really didn't happen anywhere at all, right? And yet defund became what right-wing folks, police associations, in partnership with mayors, if we're going to be quite frank, it's certainly what happened here, used to blame the uptick in violence and in property crime that came with the COVID-19 pandemic. But it's really important for folks to understand that the reason why we saw an uptick in property crime and violent crime was because of the economic pandemic that came hot on the heels of the COVID-19 pandemic, right? Because of the loss of social services, the loss of resources, the loss of jobs, the trauma that came with the loss of life, or being afraid that you were going to lose your life, right? Those things pushed a bunch of people into the underground economy. And the collective we, did not take care of those folks in the way that they needed to be taken care of. And I know that here in Oakland, we rang the alarm bell. We knew what was coming as activists and organizers inside of the Black community. We said this is going to create dire and desperate conditions, and the time to front load the investment in communities is now, and we were ignored, right? We were ignored, and we were told there weren't the funds to do that. But those funds were sitting inside of the bloated budget of the Oakland Police Department. I also mentioned that I'm the executive director of the Justice Teams Network. We do similar work, but we do it at the state level. So we have 15 anchor orgs across the state of California that we train, that we support in their campaigns, that we unite when we're working on state policy and legislation. So I want to talk today about eradicating state violence. That is our mission. And I giggle a little bit every time I read it, right? That the mission of our organization is to eradicate state violence in the communities of color. It's a big mission, but it is a mission that we believe that we can accomplish. And I think that it's important then that I start, because people also often ask me about our name. And I want to talk about why we actually call it state terror. Not state violence, but state terror. And to understand that, then you have to understand how Black people experience policing in America. To be Black in America often feels like being hunted. We worry every time our loved one leaves the house. We give our children the talk on how to survive being pulled over by law enforcement. We are clear that every time we are pulled over, even if everything is updated and legal, simply failing to use our turn signal may be a death sentence. We are repeatedly re-traumatized and triggered every time there is another killing, right? And we hear about the killings way more than the general public do, because those killings, even if they don't make the news headlines, we are hearing about them in our communities. There is no other group of children that have so much early and consistent contact with law enforcement, from their communities to their schools. And the primary way that Black women experience state violence is through sexual assault. The first time that I was threatened with rape in my life was by a Las Vegas Metropolitan Police officer. Additionally, I would argue that the United States of America utilizes local law enforcement as the frontline soldiers to maintain the status quo and reap the benefits of race-based capitalism, which is the financial foundation of this country, as it originated out of chattel slavery. To understand the violence that permeates law enforcement culture and behavior, it is important to note that the first police in this country were slave catchers in the South and union crushers in the North. Their job then was to catch, kill, and incarcerate Black folks in the name of protecting the economic foundation and prosperity of this country, and they continue to do so. That is their job, to protect property, not the people. And it's a feudal system, right? Because it actually does not get us to what all of us want. All of us want and deserve to live inside of safe communities. But the way America does policing results in expensive and feudal mass incarceration. An Associated Press analysis of the cost of prisons in the state of California says, in 2017, California's budget estimated that the cost of jail for each inmate in the state would reach $75,560. That's about $2,000 more than the price of a year at Harvard University, counting tuition, room and board, books, and other expenses. So I ask you, which person is going to contribute to our communities and which person is going to drain it? It's a no-brainer. And what does it solve? We take people who have learned to express their trauma through violence, and then we throw them into the most violent institutions in the world, and then we spit them back out into communities with no resources or supports. What do we think is going to happen? What's more, it does nothing to make us whole or healed. I'm both a survivor of sexual assault and domestic violence. And what I'm clear about, the pathway that actually led me to becoming an abolitionist, is that my perpetrator sitting in a cage does nothing to heal me or make it right or make it better. But those same people getting help, therapy, resources, and supports, while also identifying what a resolution looks like to me, because abolition is not about not having accountability, right? But what resolution and restitution to me looks like is a much better path for me, the causer of harm, and the entire community. On average, cops, I said that last year they killed 1,066. On average, they kill upwards of 1,000 people a year, while in sheer numbers, they kill more white folks than any other racial group. Per capita, Black people bear the majority of this violence. The other thing that policing in America looks like is maintenance of a class system that locks significant numbers of people out of the ability to pursue a quality life. I mentioned it earlier, if people are locked out of the above ground economy, they will make a way in the underground economy. Everyone needs the things that many of us take for granted, right? Housing, food, clothing, to be able to provide for their children. People are going to find a way to get it one way or another. It's why we argue so hard for prevention, and that it ensures people have their basic needs met from jump. That is a much better utilization of municipal dollars, right? They continue to invest in militarized police departments who, if you look at what is happening in our communities right now when their budgets have not been touched, clearly is not doing the job that they say that they are going to do. The way that we do policing in America also results in an exacerbation of America's longstanding race issues. It also does nothing to resolve crime or reduce crime. There's literally no definitive data that demonstrates that more cops mean less crime. And you can actually think about it. If you're in the hood, so here in Oakland, those are the flats, it's East and West Oakland. I can't look at any direction, right, without being able to spit on a police car because we are so over policed and our communities are occupied. And yet that is the place where the vast majority of violent crime and or property crime happens. But if I go into other neighborhoods, right, like where the woman that I ran against for mayor lives, you can't find a cop in broad daylight with a flashlight, right? But there are resources there. There are grocery stores there. There are there's quality foods there. There's clean parks there, right? It looks like a community, right? Those are the things that keep us safe. The other thing that policing does in America, the way that we do it, is create trauma and compound trauma. And this matters when we think about where trauma sits in the cycle of violence. Healthy, happy, and whole people do not hurt people. Traumatized, wounded, and desperate people hurt people. What America's policing does not result in is the thing that all of us want the most, and that is safety. We cannot incarcerate our way to a safe society. If we could, America would be the safest country on the planet because we incarcerate more people in this country than any other developed country, and a lot of those developed countries combined. The United States is the world leader in incarceration, despite the national incarceration rate being at its lowest in 20 years, with about 25% of the world's prison population being in the United States. The United States currently has over 2.1 million total prisoners. The prison population in 1972 was 200,000, almost 2 million less than it is today. And despite what you've been told since you were a little kid, more cops do not mean less crime. So, how do we eradicate state terror, right? This is not an exhaustive list. I do not claim to have all the answers, but what I hope it does is spark your imagination, right? And increase conversation, and that these become things that you can build on as we think about how we imagine public safety in our communities. So first and foremost, we have to admit that it's happening. You would be stunned, and I am stunned by how many times I am still trying to convince people that America has a problem with police violence. Despite the onslaught of videos and news stories, large numbers of Americans don't believe that police violence is an issue. Or even worse, they believe it is the fault of the victims, right? We see America's anti-Blackness often in the comment sections on stories where there have been egregious cases of police violence. We also need to develop a zero tolerance policy. Cops have got to be held accountable. Despite incredible efforts to create that accountability, police associations, things like the Peace Officers Bill of Rights, the secret culture of policing, the incestuous relationship between police departments and district attorneys' offices, and the continued practice of lateral moves makes it nearly impossible. If cops can harm or kill with impunity, what is the incentive for them to stop? Even with the passage of laws like here in California, 392, where we changed the use of force policy in the state of California for the first time in 150 years, there continues to be rampant use of deadly force with little accountability. And all they have to say is, I was afraid for my life. They're actually trained to say that. That is part of their training by their police associations. If you ever find yourself in a situation where you have murdered, well, they don't use the word murder, but I do because language matters, right? Where you've been involved in an officer-involved shooting. I was afraid for my life. I thought they had a gun. She was so out of control, I didn't know what to do. They were reaching for something. All of those, whether or not there was actually a weapon present, become justifications for police murder. We also need to stop lying to ourselves about what police do and do not do. In 2019, only 4% of calls to the Oakland Police Department were about violent crime. The rest were related to things like mental health crisis, issues with the unhoused, etc. Things, again, we do not need law enforcement agencies for. Police are not preventing violent crime. They respond to it. Right? It is after the fact. If the police are on the scene, it means that the violence has already happened. And even that response depends on which part of the city you live in. There's a program called Ceasefire that folks are familiar with. But we've learned, right, it's a carrot and stick approach. But since the pandemic and since the homicide spike, it's been all stick. Arrest levels have remained the same. Crime continues to go up. We need humane interventions that actually prevent crime. 2, we need to enact radical, irrational reforms that interrupt hundreds of years of bad practice. We need to do away with things like the Police Officers Bill of Rights that most states have some version on, right, that protects police more than it protects the people when we are harmed by them. We need it to end qualified immunity. That is actually one of the fastest ways that we can get to eradicating state violence, is for law enforcement officers themselves to be held accountable and responsible for the damage that they do. We need to do away with police associations. They call themselves unions. I do not. I use the word association intentionally because they are not unions. Police officers are not labor, and police associations serve no purpose other than to protect bad actors. Studies show that cities with strong police associations actually have more violence against community members by police. We need to redefine and reimagine public safety. We need to get to the root cause. We need to invest in prevention. We need to provide for people's basic needs. We need to look at healing both the causer of harm and the survivor of that harm, right? A holistic response that then ultimately leads to whole communities. We need to demilitarize law enforcement. Cops do not need tanks, and they shouldn't be cruising through our communities with AR-15s. There's data that demonstrates clearly that the more militarized a police department is, the more violent they are. There's also studies, by the way, because a lot of folks talk about diversifying police departments, that actually shows no difference in the levels of violence in police departments either. And there was actually one study that came out of the University in St. Louis that showed that more diversified police departments actually can lead to more community violence as police officers of color try to show that they too belong, right, in the club of blue. And so often they could be more violent and more ruthless. Some of you may know that famous NWA line, black cop showing out for the white cop. And we need to develop alternative models of responses to community crisis. Data shows that the best way to decrease police violence is to decrease interactions between community and law enforcement. And if police are stop being called to respond to every community crisis, then right, they can actually focus on what we may need them to actually do, respond to violent crime, because that's the other thing you will hear in police departments across the country. Oh, we don't have the staff. We need more people. We need more money. Well, if they were not chasing stray dogs and towing cars, they would have the staff time and they would have the money. Police do not need to be in our schools, respond to mental health crisis, respond to interpersonal violence, respond to neighborhood disputes, engage in traffic stops, and so much more. And that is actually, right, a big piece of the work that we're launching right now is to get cops out of traffic stops. Traffic stops for Black and Brown and Indigenous people are deadly. They are the primary way that our folks get entangled in the criminal legal system. They are often igniting incidents, right, to the horrific stories that we see. And then we all, I know, are still carrying the name of Tyree Nichols inside of our hearts, who was murdered as a result of a traffic stop, right? We talk about dismantling law enforcement, but it's also important that we are building at the same time, building alternatives, right? Part of why that we remain stuck in the cycle is because we've been told the lie that the only way that we're going to get to safe communities, right, is through the violence of policing and prisons. But we know that that is actually not true. And we have learned through the implementation of mental health first, that when communities have an alternative option, they use it. They call. In the very first weekends of launching Mental Health First, our phones rang off the hook and they continue to do so, right? The need is greater than even we and our volunteer team has the ability to keep up with, because this is what folks want. Eradicating policing as we know it and rebuild it from the ground up. So like I said, this isn't a complete plan. I don't have all the answers. What I do know is that we aren't doing it right. I do know that the way we do public safety in this country isn't working for anyone, even white folks. I know that people are profiting off of crime, ghost gun manufacturers, campaign contributions, operators of private prisons, imprisonment, and violence. And I know that there's a better way. When I started this work, I wanted to be right. I screamed and yelled and ranted and raved. I wanted the people to see how right I was, how wrong they were. I don't care about being right anymore. I've reached a point now, as I'm approaching 50 years old and 20 plus years as an organizer, I've settled into knowing that I'm right, that we are right, that the voices of Black and Brown and Indigenous people that are saying enough is enough and this isn't working, they are right. We don't have to prove that anymore. At this point, though, I do want to win. I want people to stop dying. I want justice. I want equity. I want safety for myself, my daughter, and my community. I want people to see the logic and understand that the radical is actually the rational. I believe that's what we all want, and I hope that conversations like these can get us there. So I'm always more interested in hearing what people want to ask me than talking. So I'm gonna stop with my rant there, and I'd like to actually open it up to y'all for the next 15-20 minutes for us to chat.
We've got a kind of involved question from a student, Zandra. How do we talk about this with our 8-year-old and younger Black kids? My son was shown a video by his second grade teacher in Redlands that was not age appropriate, and in the video showed white cops hitting and spraying Black men and women protesting. And he asked me, why don't police like Black people, Mommy? What is the best approach? Maybe if it's too much to answer, that is fine. I have a feeling you can answer that question, Kat.
Well, I actually think the best approach, right, has to be determined by the family. So my daughter was raised in the movement, right? So from the time that she was born, she was either on my breast or she was under the table during movement meetings. And so she grew up hearing about the horrors of white supremacy. She grew up on the flatbeds of trucks as we were rolling through the streets, protesting yet another state-sponsored murder. For me, one of the proudest moments of my parenting was, I think she was about 14, maybe 15, and we were on the truck and the cops were getting ready to tear gas us. And historically, what I would have done is turn to her and tell her to mask up. And as I turned to tell her, she was already getting ready. And I don't. There's benefits and there's costs of that. My daughter has absorbed a lot of trauma through the hearing of murder after murder after murder. She's grown up, in a place of fear. She's grown up with a lot of anger. But I made the decision, right, that I wanted her to be rooted in truth and the reality. It was actually never okay for her to be bought into the lie that the carceral state and the way that America does policing and prisons in this country would ever work for her, right? I needed her to understand the system so that she can navigate it, so she can better fight it, so that eventually we can win at dismantling it. So that's the choice that I made, and I think sometimes too that we underestimate our kids in terms of what they can understand, right? Like, I think that there's a way to talk about chattel slavery and the fact that law enforcement came out of that, right? And that it's actually not about individual interactions. It's about an institution, right? And talk about what the antidote to that is. And maybe that's a way to soothe your son's soul a little bit. Show pictures of Black people protesting without the violent response, right? There's beautiful pictures of Bree Newsom climbing the flagpole, right? That I couldn't wait to show my daughter that picture, right, when Bree did that. Celebratory, victorious pictures, because actually Black resistance is beautiful, right? It's not tragic. It's beautiful. They've been trying to cancel us for 400 plus years, and they've never been able to accomplish it because we are resilient, resistant, magical, and magnificent people. And I think that's maybe what you counter some of the scarier, more violent parts of the story with.
Great. And Zandra writes, thank you so much. We will work on this for the summer. I would also add, with your permission, Kat,
Of course,
the motivation of the teacher to show second graders something like this, as Zandra says, it's age inappropriate, especially in light of the fact that they're trying to take discussions, all sorts of discussions, out of schools. Teachers have been fired for some of the most trivial things, and yet here we have, in a place in Southern California, where children are being shown these videos without context. And so this young man, this boy, sounds traumatized almost from seeing, and I wonder what the other students went home and said about this video that this teacher showed. I think I would, as a parent, talk to the teacher and find out what's going on, what else is happening in the classroom that I should know about. But I think I would object strongly to my child being shown something like that, an 8-year-old, without context. What do you think?
Yeah, and I don't know what context the video was presented in.
Yeah.
And I think we have to have that piece of the conversation inside of this larger national context, right? where we see right-wing folks trying to pull out of our school systems anything about slavery, anything about civil rights, anything about, the violence of cisgendered patriarchy and white supremacy, literally whitewashing, if you will, history. I think that's dangerous too. Right. I think that we can go, and we are going too far in the other direction and literally rewriting history in such a way that yet again, or even to a higher degree, Black folks and brown folks aren't going to see themselves in what's being taught. And white folks, right, aren't going to understand why they have the privilege and the power that they do inside of this country.
The other added thing is that Zandra says that he is the only Black child in the class, which sort of reinforces my thought that this young man should not have been shown that video. As the only Black child in the classroom, and he's seeing people who look like him being beaten up on a screen, that to me would just maybe be subject to a lawsuit or something. I don't know. I think I would be very, very upset about that, though, as Sandra obviously is. Yeah. So the other thing I was thinking of, it's very difficult. Most of the people in our audience today are students in a race and racism class, and they have read The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, and they understand this. But how does it get to be, and obviously for you, it is not an abstract concept that young Black and brown people are getting beaten and killed by police officers. It's not an abstract concept, but how do we bring that closer to home for our own students? They see films, they read books, but how does it become real to them? Because it's hard to imagine, if you have had officer friendly in your neighborhood all your life, it's hard to imagine police officers acting this way. I live in a very rural community in Southern California, east of San Bernardino, and I have probably seen 2 cops on my street the whole year, and maybe fewer last year. So it's difficult to think about the streets of Oakland, the streets of LA. It's not difficult for me because I came from the streets of LA, but it is difficult for young people from the suburbs to imagine this. I mean, it's so outlandish. Even though we see George Floyd, we saw Philando Castile, we see all of our children being cut down, I think it's still not registering somehow.
I think that if folks are truly interested in knowing what is happening in this country, they can use Google. And I'm not trying to be facetious, right? But if you Google officer-involved shootings or police killings this week, I saw on my radio show, Law and Disorder, I do most Thursdays, I do something called the State Terror Roundup. And what that is a roundup of stories of police abuse, murder, rape, corruption, etc. And every single week, I've got between 20 to 30 stories, right, that are ready to go. I don't use them all because I've only got 10 minutes, but that's a simple Google search, right? So and I've been doing this show for, I think we're at 7 months now. And I've had 7 to 8 stories every single week for the last 8 months. If that gives you any idea of the breadth and the amount of police violence that is happening, right? At this point, it's a choice because the conversations are out there. They are happening. There are Black, groups that are putting out information on their website. There are white solidarity groups, right? Like, go talk to the folks at Surge. for instance, right? They are amazing allies and accomplices, and have conversations both about the realities of what is happening inside of Black and Brown, Indigenous, and poor communities at the hands of law enforcement, but more importantly, how you can weaponize your white power and privilege to actually get involved and do something about it. Because at the end of the day, it can't be actually just us. Right. It's got to be across race and across class. First, an acknowledgement. That's why I said, like, that's one of the first steps that we have to take to eradicate state terror, an acknowledgement that this is happening. And then a commitment, right, to interrupt it, to build something new and different. I wouldn't tell you to ask like your Black friends to do the emotional, mental, spiritual labor, right, of proving to you that this is happening. We're telling you that's happening. Believe us, and then go do your own research.
Yeah, because one of the ways you acknowledge racism is to, or you believe that racism exists, is to believe your Black friends, to believe your brown friends, and not to deny their own experience. But I would also add to join, and I think you sort of hinted at that, to join groups that are in line with your thinking, if you really care about this issue, because the suburbs are not that far away. You know, the suburbs are among us. And we used the term last week, canary in a coal mine. You know, we have been subject to this for centuries, as you say, but it also gives cops permission to do it elsewhere. I knew a police officer who was being transferred from, you know, and people would know Firestone Station, which was a very, very busy station in Los Angeles in the 1970s and 80s. And he was, you know, really active and, you know, just a really gung-ho cop, as they used to say. And he was being transferred to Malibu Station, which the Sheriff's Department also covers. And I said, what are you going to do? I mean, it's so dull in Malibu. And he said, oh, Mary, I'm not concerned because every station has its niggers. And that was, and I was maybe 22, 23 years old, but it made me speechless, just speechless. But that's an example, I think, of he's going to take those same tactics and take them over to Malibu or wherever, and people have to know that. People have to acknowledge that just because it's happening elsewhere. I remember in the height of the South African apartheid, the whites in South Africa said they had no idea stuff like that was going on. I didn't totally believe them, but I mean, there's a way that you compartmentalize and you don't show what's happening, you know, 20 miles away or 10 miles away. So the good people in the hills of Oakland are saying that they don't know what's happening in the streets, the flats of Oakland. No?
Yeah, that's what they say. Though here we make it kind of hard for folks not to know that this stuff is happening, right? We have a reputation for shutting things down, interrupting city meetings, taking over highways, stopping traffic. Oakland has been incredibly active since the 2009 murder of Oscar Grant, and really has been the vanguard of this conversation. It was that protracted struggle with the state in response to the murder of Oscar Grant that actually kicked off this iteration of the fight to end police terror. So, and they try to say they don't know, but they hear us
know.
all. I
they know.
guarantee you. Yeah.
And I would just let our audience know that the movie Fruitvale Station, starring Michael B. Jordan, is a movie version of the incident with Oscar Grant, and it's very good. It's a very good movie, and you should see it.
Yeah, it is a very good movie.
It's a very good movie, yeah, and that's one of the first. That movie put him on the map, I think, in terms of he did a great job acting. Octavia Spencer played his mother. Was really good, and you really felt, because the killing of a young Black man or young brown man has ripple effects. This doesn't just affect that young man, but it affects people for generations. Generational trauma is what we experience. And here, we're seeing, George Floyd gets killed, but how many others have gotten killed? And, we're mourning George Floyd, and yet here we have to mourn someone else. It's a constant thing. And I just wish you all the best in terms of your activism, your work. I would just let our students and our audience know that your links are on in our chat, and that if they have a few pennies or nickels or dimes, they can shoot some of them over to you, to your organization. I mean, I know we contribute a lot to a lot of different organizations every year, but I think yours is especially deserving of funding as much as we can, because you're doing some great work, and it's not popular, but I commend you for that.
Thank you for that. Yeah,
You're welcome.
a lot of most of the work we do, right? Like it's at the will of the folks, and we are supported a lot by individuals. I mean, we have foundations that give us grants too, but it's the individual folks that give us the unrestricted dollars to be able to do things like paying impacted families rent for the month, or if there's protests, we really focus on getting Black and brown, particularly Black and brown trans folks, out of jail as fast as we can. So we've got a bailout program. So those are the kinds of things that your dollars go to, or your cents, whatever you can give, go to for us to be able to do. Yeah.
Fantastic. And I would also just add that that I am hopeful. I think if we think about the things that, slavery was an institution for 250 years.
Yep.
And we changed that. Activism, people getting out on the streets, John Brown giving his life. And today is John Brown's birthday. I want to acknowledge that. Today is his birthday. And I would just say that, and my students know about John Brown too, but I would just say that we can't give up hope. We can't say that, all this stuff is happening, Florida, Texas, don't say gay, all of this stuff. But I think, it's like when you go to a protest, the mantra is the people united will never be defeated. And we've got to unite. We've got to see ourselves as communal, as a community. And I have every hope that we can do that with people like you and other organizations who are coming together. I really believe we can effectuate that. So keep up the good fight and courage.
That's the plan.
Yes. Well, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
Kat. And I would just, before we close out, I would just let our students know that those links are there. So if you appreciate what you have heard today and in the past, please pass on your pennies to Kat and her organization. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Everybody take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.